You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Habitat University. This podcast is your source for the science behind wildlife habitat management and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. We're your hosts, Jared Brook.
And I'm Adam Janke, and we're both biologists and extension wildlife specialists. If you're interested in wildlife habitat management or looking for ways to improve your property for wildlife, this is the podcast for you.
So join us as we talk with researchers, managers, and landowners all about the latest research and the ins and outs of wildlife habitat management.
Hey, Jared, can I tell you a story?
Sure, why not?
Okay. So a few years ago, I was hunting on public land, and I had found this stand that I was pretty excited about, a place to put a stand. It was in like a thicket in the middle of like a sea of corn in this river bottom public land spot.
Sounds like Iowa.
Yeah, thanks. And very Iowa.
And
so
in Indiana as well.
Well, yeah, sure, in Indiana. And in Indiana, we would call this a thicket. Like, Iowans don't really call these things thickets, but that's what we always called them growing up in Indiana. So shrubby cover, some trees, grasses. And that corn was standing the first day that I hunted it, and deer were coming out of the corn and moving through this thicket like the whole time I was in there. So I was really excited about this spot. I came back the next day, parked, saw that the corn had been harvested, and proceeded to lock my keys in my car. Instead of, this story has a point, I promise. And it's instead of going to the stand, I had all my stuff. I just didn't have my keys. So it was like, okay, I probably shouldn't like wait until I like get a deer or try to do this at night. And so I used an arrow to try to fish my keys out of my car. And a really nice gentleman pulled up and offered to drive me all the way back to Ames, and then was just making small talk with me. And I pointed to where my stand was, and he just offered offhand. He said, "Oh, they just picked that corn yesterday. That ought to be really good for that stand." And I remember I was mad that they had picked the corn, right? Because the corn like provides all this shelter and cover and safety for these deer to access this like thicket in the middle of a cornfield. Yet here this guy was like confidently asserting that because the corn had been harvested, that my prospects were somehow better. And I remember so first I used a willow switch to get the keys out of the car, and the arrow thing was not working. So I did get the keys out. I went and sat in the stand, and I spent the rest of the night just like pondering what in the world made this guy think that somehow the stand was improved by the fact that, I don't know, 95% of the food that was there the day before was now in a semi truck or in some grain bin down the road. And then all the cover was gone. So these deer could like no longer safely access this thicket. I did not see any deer that night. They had all been pushed out of there. I mean, that's typical, but they were no longer safe in there. And then that spot totally went dry because it was so isolated in the middle of that crop field. And so other than a couple of points of the story that maybe I'm bad at picking tree stand spots, among other things, the lesson for me is I think people put way too much weight on what meets the eye. And where I've sort of settled out with this story is that this guy, he sees deer in harvested cornfields. He sees them from like a mile away all the time, driving to work, driving to hunting spots, from the tree stand all the way across the field and other things. And so he thinks he's kind of processed in his mind, picked corn means deer, but he hasn't processed what I had intuited, which was standing corn means deer too. You just can't observe it. And so the reason I wanted you to humor me in telling this story is that because I think it sets up this episode well, because we want to talk about sort of the science of making observations in wildlife and wildlife habitat situations, and how we can apply those to basically make better decisions, and more decisions that are more likely to positively impact the wildlife that we're trying to touch with land that we own or have influence over.
So I guess we're saying is that sometimes what you observe is not meet reality, right? So your expectations doesn't meet reality.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And that's where I want to take this. And I know that you are perhaps a reluctant participant in this episode because this is a little bit on the ivory tower side, but let's go through it and kind of see where we end up. And I appreciate you humoring me. I want to share with the listeners the best example of how you humored me is that I insisted at the inception of this episode to call this the Moneyball problem. And the Moneyball problem comes from some thinking that I actually was thinking about during my PhD work, and my PhD advisor encouraged me to read this book called The Moneyball, that is all about how the Oakland Athletics in the early 2000s, despite having the odds stacked against them because they had very little money to spend on their players, were very successful in winning a majority of games and also making it to the playoffs 2 years in a row, despite the fact that they had the third lowest salary cap in the entire league. And the way that they did it was by focusing on the right outcomes or the right measurements, and not just sort of feeling their way through or following convention. And so this is also the subject of a movie. And Jared, we had to share with the listeners that you were a pretty good sport. You not only watched the movie, but you also read the entire book at my suggestion, just to see if you could make any sense out of this.
Yes. So Adam called me a reluctant participant, partly because he forced me to read the book without giving me the reason why. So it was a good book, so I'm glad I read it. And I think there's some interesting takeaways from the book that can be applied to habitat management and to wildlife management. So I'm interested to see where you take this, Adam. And I'm going to let you bat lead off to give another baseball
I like
reference.
The baseball.
And
Okay.
I'll just kind of chime in and listen and add some anecdotes. So
Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, hang with me here. I'm just in a storytelling mood today, I guess. So a couple of things. So to connect it back to the original trucks, the keys stuck in the truck example, the metric, that person was putting too much weight on their own observations. They were too used to seeing harvested corn equals deer. They weren't thinking critically about unharvested corn. You can't see deer.
Basically because deer were easier to see in pit cornfields compared to even in the woods or uncut cornfield. They were inferring that because they see them out in that pit cornfield that they use that more, even though it's probably because it's easier to see them.
Yep, exactly. And so the Moneyball equation is that in this early 2000s time period, some people had been thinking and writing about baseball metrics, and basically baseball pros were sort of all engaged in this groupthink. They were kind of all engaged in thinking that traditional metrics like stolen bases, runs batted in, and batting average were the best way to sort of gauge the quality of a player or a batter in this case. And they weren't focusing on a metric that maybe more accurately predicted the outcome they all wanted. The outcome they wanted was to win baseball games. And so what you really need is not necessarily this person that's like hitting a home run, once every, 20 at bats. It's going to show how dumb I am when it comes to baseball, but whatever would be a good home run percentage. You don't necessarily need that. What they wanted to do was win baseball games. And the way that they were figuring out through some statistical methods and also just sort of critical thought was that on-base percentage was a much better predictor of the quality of a person's contributions to a team's victory than those other traditional metrics. And so in the book, there's a couple of quotes, but I wanted to pull one out that sort of like sets it up. So this is relatively early in the book. And they were talking about this guy that influenced the main character. The main character is Billy Bean. He was played by Brad Pitt. in the movie. So Billy Beane was influenced by this guy Bill James, who had been thinking about baseball metrics through time. And Bill James, the book summarizes Bill James' thinking as this: think for yourself along rational lines, hypothesize, test against the evidence, never accept that a question has been answered as well as it ever will be. Don't believe a thing is true just because some famous baseball player says that it's true. Could we not substitute a few key words and find ourselves back to wildlife habitat management and the challenges that we have with actions that maybe don't actually have positive impacts on the goals that we've established on our land by that same logic?
Yeah. So to bring it back to your first example, Adam, thinking about the wrong outcome. So the gentleman that you ran into in the parking lot, like, he was probably thinking, like, my outcome is killing a deer, and he probably happens to kill deer out of cornfields or cut cornfields or near cornfields or see deer, when the real outcome, what we would think about is, what is providing habitat for those deer and how can we improve the habitat? And if we stuck a bunch of radio collars on those deer, then we would probably infer something completely different based on where those deer are using. And we'd probably say that they're using those crop fields less than we would expect, or, less than they are available on the landscape.
Exactly. Yep. And so what I always say of professional wildlife biologists is that we basically go to college to learn how to count stuff. And my master's advisor used to always say that too. And that's really true. And it sounds, on its surface, it sounds a little silly. Like, really? Like, you went to college for 11 years to learn how to count things? I think I learned that in kindergarten. But that doesn't work, because
we would go to school to count things that are reluctant to be counted.
Exactly, right? Because things are reluctant to be counted. So that's where we get into, like, these examples from the wildlife literature, where we spend a lot of time thinking about things. So I wrote down, like, the main stumbling blocks in terms of observing wildlife that I think we professional wildlife biologists are trained to think about, and that landowners or people that have influence over land that are thinking about their experiences with wildlife habitat management and trying to improve properties for wildlife habitat would benefit from keeping these sorts of things in their mind as well. The type of stuff we're bludgeoned with through school. So I've got 4 of these sort of broad principles that we're sort of bludgeoned with through school that I want to kind of work through.
All right, Adam, I'm here to make sure that you don't get too sciencey on us, and that we can break some things down. So I'll hear you out. But
okay, deal. Okay, the first one is one, and that is, I think that's gonna work. The first one is, we've already talked about it, limiting factors, like this idea of, like, limiting factors. And so wildlife biologists are trained to think really critically about what is a limiting feature for wildlife on any given property or given parcel. And so we think of that, I don't know, Jared, you and I learned at Purdue the idea of Liebig's law of the limiting. I certainly learned that from Dr. Weeks when I took wildlife habitat management there. And I think that's actually a concept that comes out of, like, chemistry, but it doesn't really matter. We've talked about that before. We've talked about habitat. When we talk about the word habitat, we have to remember that certain things are in greater supply or more constrained supply, and that in order to positively impact outcomes that we have to think about what the limiting factors are. So that's one sort of high level priority that I think wildlife biologists are trained to think about, that landowners could certainly apply to their logic and sort of addressing this Moneyball problem.
Yeah, and so I guess tie it back to the book. They were trying to use data and analytical science and statistics to identify, what is that limiting factor that's limiting them from winning baseball games, right?
Exactly. Yep. And it wasn't like stolen bases. Like, okay,
or
cool.
RBIs.
Yeah. Like the crowd goes wild for stolen bases. But at the end of the day, they're not selling tickets on stolen bases. They're selling tickets on victories, like wins. And the way that you win a baseball game is by putting people on the bags, like on base percentage. And so that was the key insight of the period. So, okay. So what's the limiting factor? Not stolen bases. It's putting people on the bases. What's the limiting factor in wildlife habitat management? We're going to get into that some more, but we like to think that it's food, and it isn't always food. That's just like, and we're going to come back to that in the episode. Okay. So the next one, this is ripped from the headlines from a really important paper that everybody has to read like all the time in wildlife habitat management. Density as a misleading indicator of habitat quality. Density in this case is animals per unit area, and misleading indicator of habitat quality means that just because there's a bunch of animals at any given spot doesn't necessarily mean that we need to replicate those conditions everywhere. Now, there are certainly scenarios where we do want to do that, learn from the best areas, the wildlife areas or whatever, but there's also lots of scenarios where animals may just be forced into conditions that they don't really want to be in, that they may be in poorer condition, or they may be starving or something in those areas.
More risk for predation.
Or more risk for predation that would not be good to replicate on a large scale. And that way density becomes misleading. Like we could say like, oh, here we go. There's a ton of deer out there in that picked cornfield. Well, they're also getting harassed by every vehicle that drives by, or they're getting, they're struggling to find food out there because 95% of it's off to the grain elevator and other factors. But it seems intuitively that there's a lot of deer out there. And so density then leads us down the wrong path, that we aren't thinking clearly about what wildlife really need.
So that's that whole concept of an ecological sink, right? Where animals are forced into an area that's not productive. So, if the best quality habitat is taken by a certain number of individuals, and there's more individuals than that area can support, then the other individuals are forced into these kind of lower quality areas that may be less productive from a breeding standpoint, lower survival, higher risk of predation, but you may see densities be higher in that area, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's better for that species.
Exactly. Yeah. So that ecological sink, that's like a really important concept in ecology that we think about a lot of times. And that's why we have to measure appropriate responses.
All right. So tie that back to the book. Where's that fall into the book and the movie?
Okay. Well, dang it. Now you're really, I don't know. You're the one that read it more recently. I haven't read it since my PhD. I guess my thinking on that would be that it's kind of, in the same vein as some of those like home runs or those sort of glamorous statistics, like just like those flashy numbers are sort of misleading.
So, number of home runs a team has isn't necessarily correlated to the number of wins they have, right? So that's exactly. Like using the wrong metrics to define kind of your end goal. So if you're measuring your team's success by home runs, stolen bases, it may not actually correlate to how many wins the team has.
Exactly. Yep. Okay. So we did Liebig's Law of the Lemming. We talked about density as a misleading indicator of habitat quality. The next one, again, it's also in sort of a similar vein, but is another really important concept in wildlife research, and something we spend an agonizing amount of time in statistical software trying to deal with, is the problem of imperfect detection. And so that is to say that that's what we talked about. Like, we are trained to count things, but really we're trained to count things that we can't see, because wildlife by their very nature don't want to be detected. That's how they survive. And so a huge amount of work in wildlife research is just trying to figure out how to overcome this barrier of counting an organism that doesn't want to be counted, or measuring an outcome of that organism, like young produced or whatever, when they don't want us to be able to find their nest because they think we're a predator. And so the problem of imperfect detection, we have all sorts of statistical methods and other sorts of ways of confronting this and acknowledging that we can't observe perfectly how many deer are, for example, using a standing cornfield, but we know we can use certain methods to overcome those limitations and draw better inferences about where the deer really want to be.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to counting wildlife, I often hear people ask, like, well, how many of X species, or how many of X individual of this species are there? How many deer are there in the state, of Iowa or Indiana? And, it seems like a simple question that should have a simple answer. And the answer I always get back is like, well, we can't even figure out how to count every person in the United States, right? There's error bars associated with our census. Not everybody's going to fill out the survey. Not every deer is going to be available to be surveyed. So we always have error bars.
Okay, the last thing that we wildlife ecologists are like forced to learn and have to think about a lot, and that could benefit anybody when they think about wildlife habitat, is just the whole concept of randomization and control over conditions and outcomes. And this is actually a concept that's like central to science generally. Like this is like the distinction between the scientific method of inquiry and then like everything else, like just feeling your way through things. And that is to say that we want to, whenever we get an opportunity, to try to control as many confounding factors and other things that we can to try to draw valid inferences about whatever system we're studying. And so in wildlife research, we think a lot about like issues of convenience sampling. That's a common term that we learn about that is basically like, don't put too much weight on what you're seeing from the windshield of your pickup, because what you see from the windshield of your pickup may not necessarily be what's actually playing out in all the places that you can't see from that windshield.
Yeah, I like that. The windshield sampling there, because I think if we take time to drive around our properties that we manage or things, and it kind of go back to your corn example, we may see a lot of deer or turkey in food plots around the property. We may see them a lot when we're out hunting or whatever, and then we may infer, well, they really like to spend time out in those food plots, so we must need more food on the landscape. That must be our limiting factor. But I think that doesn't account for the 250, 300 days of the year that you're not driving around your property or sitting in the stand, and the times, if you sit in a stand for 8 hours in a day and you see deer 2 times a day in the food plot, well, what are they doing for the other 16 hours of the day that you're not hunting and they're not in the food plot or whatever? So I think that convenience sampling, we see deer out in the food plot while we're hunting, and then we infer, well, maybe food is what's limiting deer on our property.
So yeah, the control over where we make our observations is really important in thinking about this issue of what we decide we want to do on the land. And so actually, I'm going to go up the ivory tower again and share one more example, because this whole this is just central to science. Like, people talk about this stuff. It doesn't matter if you're a physicist or a chemist or a biologist. This issue of control over how you observe things and being very mindful about biases that you bring to your work is really central. And so, have you ever heard of the streetlight effect, Jared?
I haven't. This is new to me, so okay. I'm a little excited and worried to see where this is going.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's not long. It's just like, this is apparently like goes way back, like it's sort of the philosophy of science thing.
Well, it can't go that far back if it's a streetlight, right?
Yes. Well, and it involves keys. So, I mean, not way back, but like early 1900s. So, okay. So from Wikipedia, I just looked it up because I learned this kind of stuff. And then I was like, oh, where did I read that? And Wikipedia is the ultimate authority here. So from Wikipedia, a policeman sees a drunk man searching for something under a streetlight and asks what the drunk has lost. He says he lost his keys, and they both look under the streetlight together. After a few minutes, the policeman asks if he is sure he lost them here, and the drunk replies no, that he lost them in the park. The policeman asks, Why is he searching here? And the drunk replies, this is where the light is. And I just think that's a perfect metaphor for the example you just gave of the food plot thing. Why do you think the deer need all the food plots? Well, that's where I observe all the deer. And that's where the light is, because that's where I focus my search efforts, even though the deer may actually need something, far disconnected from the food plot. Now, we don't mean to be too hard on the food plot thing, but we're just trying to process through how to think objectively about what's going on the
So I guess
farm.
the thing to take away from that is that, if you're interested in improving your property for deer, and say you use cameras or you do other kinds of surveys, don't put all your cameras in one kind of vegetation type,
Exactly.
right? Don't put them all out on the food plot and then try to infer how much deer are using your property, right? So scatter them out, put them in the woods, put them on food plots, kind of randomly distribute across your property to get a better indication of how deer are moving around the property and what areas they're using, what areas they're not.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's a perfect segue too, because now down out of the ivory tower, back out into the real world, and how do we actually apply this thinking? And so what we want to do now is we want to walk through some of the key takeaways from the book and discuss how we can apply those concepts, like this Moneyball thinking, to wildlife habitat management, wildlife habitat assessment, and just improving the outcomes that we expect on the farm. Before we do that, Jared, I wanted to share this quote with you that I stumbled into here as I was preparing.
So what I'm learning at is I'm the metaphor person and you're the quote person, right?
I guess I don't. Yeah, I guess that's what it is. So yeah, I don't have a lot of quotes. One Wikipedia quote, one from Moneyball, and then here this quote from Paul Arrington. Paul Arrington, an early sort of founder of the discipline that we recognize as wildlife management. Now, we spent time earlier in the podcast talking about the fact that wildlife habitat management goes as far back as people go, but the sort of science type stuff that that we're trained in, the sort of Western thinking of wildlife habitat management, Paul Arrington was really influential on that. He was South Dakota native, and then he was actually an Iowa State professor for a long time, and he wrote some books. One of them was On Predation and Life, which was sort of talking about some of his research and pioneering ideas about how predators and prey interact. And anyway, in the prologue of that book, he wrote something that I really like that resonates with me, and thinking about sort of overcoming this temptation to put too much weight on our observations. So Paul Arrington wrote, I must acknowledge that I did have to unlearn much that I learned wrong as a hunter or trapper. My earlier tendency was to ascribe undue significance to what I could learn merely through being an outdoorsman, and it took me a long time to appreciate the importance of slowly and patiently gathering facts from which to draw conclusions. I liked to take intuitive shortcuts without always reserving judgment when I had no valid basis for actually knowing. So now I don't want Paul Arrington's words or even this podcast to discourage people from observations, because that's what this is all about. But what we want to talk about in the rest of the episode here is emphasizing the importance of thinking about how biases can creep into our logic and how we need to make sure to focus on the right metrics to win more baseball games or to have better outcomes for wildlife habitat management.
Yeah, so now we're kind of towing that line between, and I think this is the fun line to toe, is of wildlife management and habitat management is an art and a science. So how do we blend those two things? How do we blend our observations and with, what science says about how animals use the landscape and respond to habitat management?
Yeah. And that's a really good reminder, Jared. And in fact, brings up something that I don't know exactly where we were thinking about talking about it in the episode, so I'll just say it now, is the Moneyball analogy, the baseball analogy, a little bit falls apart when we start talking about what our goals are because of the art to wildlife habitat management, to use the word you just said. And that is because in the baseball thing, everybody agrees on the outcome. It's win baseball games, because winning baseball games sells seats and that makes people money and whatever, that's the goal, or get you into the playoffs, and that's the goal. And so that's not true in wildlife habitat management, is it? It's wildlife habitat management is like, I don't know, like a couple more deer, but I'd be willing to trade off a couple more deer for like a couple of more brown thrasher nests or something like that. There's all this subjectivity in wildlife habitat management. So the analogy isn't perfect, we should acknowledge, but hopefully as we work through these takeaways from the book, people will see like why the same sort of logic about bias and why the same sort of logic about breaking dogma of traditional thinking can be useful in managing one's property for wildlife habitat.
Sounds good. Are you? I'll let you start with your takeaways from the book, since you got me into this mess.
Well, okay, sure. I mean, in fairness, I think we should. Again, like you've read the book more recently, and when we were like brainstorming this, like, okay, Adam, how do we actually like connect it? You had some really good thinking on these. So we've got.
All right. I'll start then.
We've got six different ideas of key takeaways from the book, and credit for the thinking goes primarily to you, and then I'll just like kind of substitute in some examples as well and try to keep it grounded.
So I think the first, and maybe this one sets up the other ones too, and the first one that I think about is kind of goes back to what you talked about with limiting factors, but defining the problem. So what is like your goal? What's the problem you're trying to address with habitat management? And there's a quote, and I'll have to admit this quote's from the movie, and I don't know if it's exact wording in the book or not, but Billy Beane was sitting around with all the scouts, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to win baseball games after they had lost like two of their star players, the best home run hitter and the most RBIs. And one of the scouts says, we're trying to solve a problem. And then Billy Beane says, no, you aren't. You aren't even looking at the problem. And then he asks him, okay, what's the problem? Billy Beane's trying to get the scouts to define what is the problem. They keep saying, well, we have to replace these two players, or we have to replace like the number of home runs they hit. And, Billy responds, well, the problem is actually like we have no money and all these teams have a lot of money.
Yeah.
We got to figure out how to compete at a level by spending less money. And we have to, rethink about how we're going to address those factors, like using on base percentage and all that stuff. So I think the correlation to habitat management is, we have to identify the limiting factors on our property to address the problem of, to get to our goals of, if our goal is to increase the number of northern bobwhite using our property, then we have to be willing to look at the problem and address that problem. And I think often we don't spend the time to actually address that problem. We just kind of think we know what the problem is and go forward with that. And I think the case in point, and we've already talked about it, and not to hammer on this more, but even with bobwhite, like I think there's a notion that, okay, if we want more bobwhite, we got to plant food plots, grain sorghum or whatever, to provide a food source for those birds to use throughout the year. And I think, there's an assumption there that food is what's limiting bobwhite, or food's what's limiting deer. And that's an assumption that's not really right in a lot of cases. So we're missing that problem. We're not identifying and defining the problem. We're just kind of doing something based on an assumption.
Perfect. I think that one then leads nicely. So that's number one, precise definition of the issue. Win baseball games, increase bobwhite abundance, etc. So the next one then, I think, is to focus on the right measures of the outcome. And so this kind of brings us back to the notion of those challenges in wildlife habitat, namely related to like abundance as a misleading indicator of habitat quality, or not focusing on the right outcome. So sorry, listeners, the bobwhite thing is just like, we're going to have to think about renaming the podcast. But bobwhites are another good example. And that is because you could do stuff on your land that results in there being a lot of whistling male bobwhites every spring. Because bobwhites are transient. They move around. And what I always say is like male bobwhites have like nothing better to do than to just find the highest point in the grassland and just like whistle their heads off all day long. And I think that tendency to like constantly be visible and to constantly be whistling leads people to putting basically too much weight on what those conditions are, where those whistling bobwhites are during that short period of time. And they ignore, especially in the north, in order for that bobwhite to have gotten to that fence post on that pasture to whistle his head off on that June day, he had to survive a heck of a winter. And he had to do it with a covey in woody cover adjacent to food. And so we may look at that pasture where that bobwhite's whistling his head off and think, oh, we've got it handled. We just need more of these pastures. And we're going to be really disappointed to find out that in the end, there's not any more bobwhites out there in June because the whole landscape turned to pasture and those bobwhites had no place to survive during the period of time that was really limiting their population, and that was during that winter survival window.
Yeah. I remember working as a private lands biologist in Kentucky and doing, I would go out and check on conservation reserve program fields, so CRP fields, and, make sure they were good to go for re-enrollment, help landowners with establishment and management, all that kind of stuff. And I remember going out in June and being in this, like, it was like one filter strip in the middle of a sea of crop fields, and there wasn't really any woody cover around, probably not within 100 or 200 yards. And I remember hearing whistling bobwhite, and I'm like, that's really interesting. I bet they won't be here in the fall, just because there was no woody cover.
Yeah.
There was nothing that was going to be attracted to them through the winter. And it goes back to that. They kind of expand their range a little bit in the summer. And then they kind of contract when that, especially in the north where you don't have that woody cover.
Yep, exactly. Well, that might also get us into the next rule that I kind of want to talk about. And this is a little bit implied in the book. It's especially implied by that quote that I shared, the whole like thinking about, think for yourself along rational lines, hypothesize, test against the evidence, never accept that a question has been answered. That whole logic that sort of underpinned this baseball analytics that the Oakland Athletics led is to ignore the allure of correlation and causation. And so this is another thing that science training, like we really get this beat into our heads, and it's important for landowners to think about this. And Jared, you and I both have an example of like this correlation and causation challenge in wildlife habitat management. And that is like just basically putting too much weight on what you've sort of intuitively observed through time. And so the classic example, at least in the upper Midwest where we do our work, is like people love to think that turkeys like eat grouse eggs or turkeys eat quail eggs. And although that's like kind of never say never, like, yeah, sure, a turkey would probably eat an egg, like you would too. Like there's not many organisms in the world that would like see an egg and not figure out a way to just like eat up that protein during that time of the year. So like, yeah, sure, turkeys occasionally eat bird eggs, but not in any sort of measurable way, and certainly not in a way that suppresses their populations. But what we see so often across the range where turkeys and grouse or turkeys and quail overlap is that as the environment shifts from a hospitable state for early successional species like grouse or northern bobwhites, wild turkeys colonize those exact same spots because it becomes wild turkey habitat. And so turkeys do better in areas that have grown up out of grouse and bobwhite habitat. And then people say there's a strong correlation between a turkey increase and a grouse decrease on my farm. One must cause the other, because we want to say correlation equates to causation. And therefore it must be that the turkeys are out there just gobbling up the grouse eggs.
All right, Adam. So I think I'm next, right?
Yes.
It's my turn to go. So
Yeah.
This is like one of probably the biggest ones that I took away from took away from the book. And I think, it goes back to, there's a common theme in the book when they talk about, how they've recruited baseball players in the past, and like looking for things like the 5 tools, or you often hear the scouts say like, well, this guy just looks like a baseball player, or like this guy doesn't look like a baseball player, so we're not interested in him because he doesn't fit the mold of like what a baseball player looks like. And that's kind of like the thing that Billy Bean's trying to break, is like, because he looked like a baseball player and he had the 5 tools and he looked good on paper, all the scouts thought he was going to be like the best baseball player in that time period, and it turned out not to be. And so he was looking for ways to kind of break the dogma of how recruiting and scouting happens, to kind of find the players that are good players but don't fit the mold, don't look like baseball players.
Yeah.
So I took that as like kind of breaking the dogma of what we hear constantly about habitat management.
Yep. So to take from that quote, like that I leaded this segment with, is like, don't believe a thing is true just because some famous baseball player says that it is true. That's sort of the logic that underlies this. And
yeah,
geez, how many times could we say that we have to overcome these issues of don't believe that a wildlife habitat management practice or some new technology is going to be the thing that liberates whatever your outcome on your farm or your property is, just because it's working at some other place, or frankly, because it's being marketed as if it were to work. And so I really like that, that breaking dogma is a really important example.
And I think just to give some tangential or some prime examples that we can kind of take away related to that, is like I often hear the recommendation of when it comes to prescribed fire, like, the best time to use prescribed fire in a native grass stand is February and March. Like, that's the best time of the year to do it, and there's really no other time to do it. And so what you get is you get lots and lots and lots of burning during one time of year. And for like a more detailed explanation of this, go back and listen to our Out of Leopold fire episode, because Marcus Lashley really breaks it down. But there's other times to burn other than February and March and April, and there's a lot of reasons why you might want to do that. But the historical recommendation, and like kind of what everybody says, is burn during the dormant season. That's the best time to burn.
Yep. And then the masses follow. Like, everybody is doing that, and then we end up with a rather heterogeneous system, or we're not actually getting the outcomes that we really declared we wanted to seek on our land. I think another place where the whole like dogma thing, it just like is a real challenge, is what I just call good old days thinking. Like, people love, especially for many farmland wildlife species, to just say like, oh, well, farms used to look like X, and that's why species is no longer found there. And I think, so if only we could get back to X, we would be totally fine. And that sort of thinking often ignores all of the other things that have changed and continue to change. The biggest one, like for my example, is like, a lot of times in the Corn Belt, people are thinking like, all we need is more small grains. If we put more small grains on the landscape, we'll be back to white-tailed jackrabbits and ringneck pheasants and Hungarian partridge and northern bobwhites and all the other farmland eastern meadowlarks and all the other farmland wildlife that have declined, and people attribute to those changes in farms. But they ignore all the invasive species that are now on the landscape, like all the cool season grasses that now define the remaining fence rows, or they ignore the fact that crop fields in the good old days were weedy messes, and today they're all GMO crops that are clean, clean by a certain definition of clean, and totally devoid of other sort of food or cover sources that would have historically been found in crop fields. So I think another of the breaking dogma thing is like just to dispense with this notion of like, all we need to do is get back to like some fixed time point in history, and really think critically about what wildlife need and what is actually limiting on the property that we're managing. Okay. Is it my turn now?
You're up.
The long pause, I was like, oh, okay, I'll go with one. Okay, number 5. the whole is greater than the sum of the parts is what we wrote down as we were kind of thinking through this. And this, again, to go back to the baseball example, is like, yeah, sure, it was great to have somebody like hitting home runs. But if that person only does the home run thing, like only some small, tiny percentage of the time, they're really not contributing that much to the team's effort towards putting points on the scoreboard. And so what we really need is not a one or two flashy players. We need a team of players that together can have the outcome that we're trying to affect on, now switching back to habitat, our land. And so that's, I think, a really important lesson from the book in the Moneyball example. And we can think of like a couple of different things for wildlife habitat that may help us think through this. The biggest one is what wildlife ecologists call cross-seasonal effects. And that is to say, like, what happens to an animal during one time of the year can influence what happens to that animal or that animal's population during another time of year. And so some important early research on this comes from a study with pheasants, where it was just like, they basically starved some pheasants during the winter time and then found that those hens that were starved during the winter time, even though they survived the winter period, were laying smaller clutches of eggs and having less nest success, like a lower probability of successfully hatching young in the subsequent spring, even though conditions during those springs were more or less unlimited. And so this concept of cross-seasonal effects could be really important. And if we think about our farms only in terms of one time period, only in terms of, for example, providing nesting habitat and ignoring how conditions during another period of the year may impact those outcomes, we may be disappointed to find that the best nesting habitat in the world just doesn't produce many young, because the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and we need to look for ways to try to improve across the year for some sort of wildlife outcome.
Yeah, so you could even take that one step further and talk about, overemphasizing one part of habitat. So overemphasizing food over cover.
Yeah.
Versus,
of course, yeah.
Versus trying to manage your property, provide food and cover to maximize its benefits to wildlife. And I think, the example from the baseball is like, if you focus on home runs at the expense of people getting on base, then you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, that's great. And that gets us back to the whole premise of this first season of the podcast here, that we want to just help people think about what we're really trying to do out here. What are the outcomes? What elements of habitat do we need to focus on? And to have a better understanding of how those organisms are responding to all those things. So, okay, that was number 5. Bring us home, Jared. Number 6.
The last one is one that, maybe in some cases maybe beyond the capability of some landowners, but it's certainly worth something thinking about. And that's using data, or using big data to drive decisions. And so in the baseball example, they were using pretty high power statistics and analytics gathered over multiple years to kind of drive their decision of what different metrics correlate to winning baseball games. And that's where they came up with the things like on base percentage and others. And so in the case of using data to drive management decisions, there's actually an example that I found related to shorebirds in California, where they were trying to produce the best kind of migratory habitat they could for shorebirds, and they used eBird data, so data from citizen science observing these birds migrating through different areas, and they used that data, which comes from multiple individuals, and then they tried to time that with when agricultural producers or rice producers in that area were drawing water down off of their rice fields. And they were trying to time, when the birds are actually migrating through with the best time to have water on those fields to provide that habitat for birds. And so they use that big data set of bird observations to then go out and identify people who are producing rice and engage them to try to get them to leave water on their fields at specific times of year to provide habitat for those migrating shorebirds, sorry.
Yeah, and that's certainly like a big frontier of wildlife research, is like using big data. But I guess as we want to wrap up the episode here and kind of like think about some like takeaways for people of any size, and I would just say that like you can collect your own data. Respectfully to that really nice gentleman that I met in that parking lot the day I was trying to fish my keys out of my car with an arrow. He was collecting data. He had data in his head. He had observed deer in harvested cornfields. So he was collecting data. He was not, however, thinking critically about how the process that generated the data that he had access to and applying that to his thinking. And so what we want to think about now, how we want to wrap up the episode, is to try to help the listeners think about what data they could conceivably collect or have access to through expertise, people that are trained in this kind of stuff, to try to think critically about the challenges on their land or land that they have influence over, and try to go about improving it. So we have some how to avoid the pitfalls and issues associated with the Moneyball problem is where we want to spend
so
the
this
last
is where the rubber
couple of
meets the
minutes.
road, right, Adam?
We're finally, if we were not out of the ivory tower yet, and I hope that we were. I felt like that was a little bit more out of the ivory tower. If we weren't yet out of the ivory tower, here we are back to the ground and trying to really think about what we could do. Jared, you already mentioned trail cameras as one way to collect data. What other sorts of recommendations do you give landowners that you're interacting with? Like, how can you collect good data on your land to inform what's happening there and start to help you think about these like limiting factors and other things?
Yeah, I think a lot of times it comes down to measuring and monitoring the wildlife species of interest to you. So just trying to find what are the best metrics and ways to do that. And if it's like deer or turkey, a lot of times you can use trail cameras. If you're really interested in songbirds, doing point counts and listening for birds at certain times of the year, at the same time of year every year, in kind of the same location, can give you an indication. And often what we're looking for is not one point in time. We're just looking for trends. So how are bird populations changing over time? One thing I tell most all landowners to keep is and it can just be a notebook in your truck, is just a running list of all of the wildlife species that you encounter on your property. And that can be an indication of, if you make some sort of management change and you observe a new species 3 or 4 years later, that could be an indication that like whatever change you did now provides habitat for that species. So that can be a good indication, a good running list to have. Whatever species you get on trail camera, whatever species you hear as you're going through the property, whatever species you see just in the truck, and so on.
Yeah, I think what wildlife ecologists, we call those indices, like what you just described as like an index of wildlife use, and those can be really valuable, especially if you do the exact same thing the exact same way every year. And like you say, you're not going to know how many dick thistles are actually nesting on your land, but you could derive an index of relative abundance of dick thistles, ignoring, those issues of imperfect detection. And as long as like whatever changes on your land doesn't impact the behavior of those birds, in this case, the dick thistles in this case, then you can reliably conclude like, are dick thistles increasing or decreasing on my property? And generally we find indices have value. I also like your suggestion of like, here's a pen, here's a piece of paper, write it down. Because that's going to help us break dogma, right? Like that's going to help us get beyond this like sort of good old days thinking and really sort of rigorously quantify like what is changing or is not changing and how on land that we own or have influence over. And that will be really invaluable in the future. And you can't go back and recreate this stuff.
Yeah, and I think there's this phenomenon, and I can't remember if I think it's called, and it applies to wildlife, it's called like the rosy glasses phenomenon or hypothesis. And it's basically like you look back in time with like a
Yeah.
brighter view of the past than may have actually occurred. So, you may have, been hunting 20 years ago and have a biased view of, how good or bad hunting was, or you may think hunting was better 20 years ago than it is today. If you write those things down, how many deer you see, how many coveys of quail you see, then you're going to have a record that say, okay, well, maybe I didn't see the 5 coveys of quail 20 years ago that I thought I did.
And make sure when you do that you're accounting for your effort. Because if 20 years ago you were 20 years younger and had a young strapping bird dog to follow around, you might be encountering a lot more coveys that way than now, 20 years older, a little bit slower, a little less inclined to get off the Kubota and go look around. That could be another way that bias creeps into our inference that we maybe would want to think of. So wildlife ecologists, we call that like accounting for effort. And we'll say like search per unit effort, like how many hours were we in the deer stand and how many bobcats did we see, would be a much better approximation than I saw 20 bobcats during say 2020 during the pandemic and I didn't have anything else to do, and in 2021 I didn't see maybe the pandemic conditions improve and I didn't get to hunt as much and I only saw 3 bobcats, and I would conclude that they would decline. So you'd want to account for your effort.
I think some other ones could be, going back to the food plot example of using exclusion cages in your food plot. So just a cage that you can set up that basically excludes deer and rabbits and things from accessing the forage. And that can be give you a really good example of how much use those food plots are actually getting. And if there's so many deer utilizing those food plots that they're actually suppressing the growth of that food plot, which is a better indication than just driving by and seeing deer in the food plot and, inferring that they're using it.
Yeah, that's a great example. Another one is measuring things in a similar way before and after you do something. And so, a lot of times people think like, oh, I just learned about, I don't know, crop tree release or something. Like I just learned about how I could, cut around my tree and all of a sudden it's going to yield a bunch of acorns. It might be worthwhile if you really want to experiment with different like crop tree release outcomes on your farm. That's just one example, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on what.
Adam, I think you're setting me up for something. Are you trying to?
Well, okay, so I was actually thinking, I was like, didn't you do this study? Like, I'm riffing right now. Okay, I'll stop talking. The bird guy will stop talking. Do the crop tree release thing.
This goes back to breaking dogma, right? And I think that the one thing that I heard a lot, and the people that were involved with this study heard a lot about acorn production in oak trees was, if you fertilize your oak trees, they're going to produce more acorns, right? That was like, there were people that would tell landowners that, like, hey, fertilize your oak trees, they're going to produce more acorns. And it makes sense, like logically, like, oh, we're going to provide oak trees more nutrients and they'll produce more acorns. And it probably makes sense because, like, if you think about corn and soybeans and things like that, we fertilize them, they produce more yield, right? Well, it's a lot more complicated than that, but no one had really looked into it. And so we did a project when I was at University of Tennessee where we basically took 120 white oak trees and figured out how many acorns they produce for 5 years, so we could get an average. And then we did these different treatments around those trees and collected acorns for 5 more years to see if there was any effect. And the things we did was we did crop tree release, where we basically cut all of the competing trees around an individual white oak. And by competing trees, I mean trees whose tops or crowns were competing with that white oak. And then we fertilized some trees. And then we also crown released or crop tree released certain trees and fertilized them. And then left a bunch of trees that we didn't do anything to. And then we compared, how did acorn production change over time? And what we found was that fertilization did nothing. So there was no impact on fertilization of by fertilizing oak trees, you didn't increase acorn production. But by thinning around the tree and giving the crown of the tree more space to grow, you actually increased acorn production.
Okay. That was beautiful. That's just a scientific method. Don't we just love it? So, okay, but let me back you just went into the ivory tower. Back grounded to reality. That's an awesome example. And what I actually think that does is a perfect example of like, okay, some questions are too big for you to be able to answer on your land. And so you need to find ways to get them answered through people like Jared that design these big, ambitious studies. And so that's another sort of takeaway. It's like you could do small scale tinkering, manipulate things like that, but you're not going to gain those really valuable insights that Jared just described. Because what'd you say, 125 trees?
120 trees, yeah.
In 10 years of study?
Yeah, and I wasn't there for all 10 years, luckily,
Sure.
But we were collecting 1,000 to 20,000 acorns each year.
So that's the type of stuff that public institutions are for.
And just one more quick example of things that you could do from a small scale thing is like if you say you implement something like a prescribed fire on a grassland and you split it in half, so you burn one section and you don't burn the other section, just doing quick plant sampling, like looking for what species are there in the unburned versus burned and things like that can be a really good way to see, well, how did that fire influence the vegetation? So that's like a very on the ground way that a landowner could use, a little bit of experimentation.
Okay. So we've got some examples. We should come back to that, like probably in a future episode of like, what are the details? Like, what are the assumptions that we make when we use a trail camera? What are the assumptions we make when we do vegetation sampling, like you're describing? So the other thing then to like overcome some of these Moneyball issues is we promise those however many cumulative years we've been in university training, Jared, 20 years or whatever of training between the two of us could help a landowner. And there's lots of people just like us that are employed in public institutions or public entities or nonprofits that have gotten this training about thinking critically, about avoiding biases and logic, about ignoring dogma and these other kind of correlation and causation and all that stuff that can help landowners. And so another idea that we have, like, for overcoming some of these Moneyball type issues and trying to implement Moneyball type thinking on your land is just to seek out and trust expertise where opportunity exists, because you're not going to do the 120 tree experiment, or you're not going to be able to follow bats with radio tracking devices to specific roost trees in the forest to know which ones are better to leave for a bat that you may be managing for others. So wildlife ecologists, wildlife biologists can do that kind of stuff. And so that's another like kind of, I think, important tool to keep in our tool belt, is to be thinking about like how we could trust and seek out that expertise and walk our properties with people that have access to that sorts of knowledge.
Yeah. So I think, what you said with trusting expertise and seeking out expertise is certainly valid, right? But there's ways that, you as a landowner can kind of learn on your own and learn for yourself. And I think that's one of the coolest things about owning land and managing for wildlife is learning all this stuff. And so while you're seeking expertise, you can certainly do that. And I would certainly suggest that, but you can also do some experiments yourself, right? So we talked about, burning one half of a field versus not burning the other, and doing some plant surveys. And that can be really important from trying to identify like if what you're doing is working, right? So if you do that experiment and your goal in burning that field is to try to increase, the number of wildflowers or forbs in that field, and you burn that field, and say in March or April, and you go out there and you're like, well, this has just as much grass and just as few forbs as the area that I didn't burn. Well, that's a really important takeaway, and that, well, maybe I need to adjust what I'm doing, rethink what I'm doing, and adapt and try to do something else, right? So that adaptive management type thing where you're observing what's going on and then changing things based on the outcome.
Yep. And you just used the word I was thinking of, adaptive management. That's one more thing that we learn in school, and many agencies and NGOs are really conscious of that concept. They'll also call it double loop learning, which means that you learn things and then you loop back around and you improve conditions.
Or learning through failure, right?
Learning through failure, yeah. And so you improve the outcomes, or you improve what you're doing. And I think that's honestly like kind of a perfect way to wrap up the episode, because we can kind of come back to this Moneyball thinking. Like a point that's very apparent in the book and also in the movie is that like this Billy Beane guy like didn't just come up with this stuff in 2002, in the year that they, did this, like they beat the odds and they won more games than would have been expected just based on their salary cap. It was the product of thinking for a long period of time, influenced by other writing and other work in baseball analytics, and sort of reflected the sort of vanguard of the thinking on how to be an effective baseball manager at the time. And then that thinking has been adapted by all the other teams like in the league, so much so that now like the Oakland Athletics wouldn't be advantaged because everybody's thinking more clearly about these concepts of like focusing on the right metrics and ignoring correlation and thinking about causation and breaking dogma and thinking about the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. And so I think for us, in thinking about wildlife habitat management, we just want to emphasize the importance of learning and the importance of collecting data, thinking about how those data were generated and what biases may creep in, and then using that information to the best of your ability, combining it with information from experts or neighbors or friends, and combining it to implement things on your property for the outcomes you're seeking to achieve, and then learning from what impact that those changes have in one year and trying to improve them in subsequent years. And if everybody did that, the art of wildlife habitat management would be a little bit more of a precise science, and I think people would be a lot more happy with the outcomes they see.
So Adam, I think I wasn't sure where you were going with this whole Moneyball problem, but I think you convinced me at the end of it. So.
Okay, and thanks for reading the book. Listeners, you don't have to read the book. That was really nice of Jared to read the book. So, okay, that's enough of that. We hope everybody enjoyed, learned some stuff. If you like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, tell your friends about it. There's a survey in the show notes that we'd love for you to fill out, provide us some feedback on what we should be talking about and how you're applying what you're learning on the show. And we hope you have a great day, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Habitat University is hosted by Purdue Extension and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Habitat University, subscribe and listen to the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
Iowa State University and Purdue University are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.